to welcome you on this Cognitive Psychology One Word seminar. I'm Valerie Camus, and I'm currently the Communication Committee of the Psychonomic Society. And then for today's talk, Beatrice will be the moderator after this excellent talk, I'm sure. And we are very happy and delightful to have Mark McDaniel presenting today his work. I'm sure everybody working on memory has read at least one, but probably many papers that Mark did. Mark is professor in psychology and brain sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. He's been associate editor at JPLMC and served in several editorial boards. He's extremely well known for his work on human learning and memory, especially on prospective memory, the work he did with Jill Einstein, but also on encoding, elaboration, retrieval process, all the things that I love. But especially what he's very keen on is to show how we can transfer knowledge from cognitive psychology to education. And I'm sure that today will be an excellent example of this, as he's going to talk about individual differences in concept learning, persistence from laboratory to classroom. A big thanks to you, Mark, for doing this talk with us today.
Valerie, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm now going to share my screen to show my slides. Make sure this is the right deck. Okay, I really appreciate the opportunity today to share with you a line of research that my colleagues and I have been conducting for at least the past decade. I hope you're going to find it stimulating and interesting, both from the perspective of theoretical advances and also from educational perspectives. To set the stage, let's consider an observation that instructors from many different classes have shared with me as we've been interacting at the center that I'm directing for integrative research on cognition, learning, and education. The observation comes from instructors in chemistry, cognitive psychology, linguistics, statistics, biology, many different disciplines. And it's this. Instructors say to me, now some students do well answering questions on exams that are similar to the examples and problems that I've presented in class or presented on homework, but they falter on the other exam questions for which the concept or problem that we've covered in class is presented in a new context. And instructors are really frustrated by this. They say, I don't get it. I don't understand why the students can't answer this question. It's about the same concept that we've covered over and over in class. And the instructors are wondering, why are they not studying enough? Are they not working hard enough? Do they have some sort of limitation on ability? It's really quite frustrating because I've spent all this time trying to cover the concept and make sure they understand it. So today I hope to build an answer to this question by posing 3 theoretical claims and providing evidence for each claim. I think you're going to find each claim interesting in its own right, but also as the claims successfully build, I think you're going to find the overall conclusions very provocative. Okay, the first theoretical claim is this. that individuals differ in terms of the particular approach and representations that they rely upon to learn concepts or conceptual problems. Some learners will adopt an abstraction approach. They push to try to learn the underlying abstraction and principles that are embedded in the instructional examples and problems that they're trained with. Other learners adopt a very different approach. They adopt an exemplar approach in which they're trying to learn and memorize the particular instructional examples and the associated response or solution that are provided during instruction to get them to acquire the concept. Now, many of you will recognize these two approaches as the two dominant themes in theoretical approaches to concept learning and representation. The extension here is that we're suggesting that for any particular problem, rather than an abstraction approach being uniformly adopted, or an exemplar approach being the explanation for learning in that case, we're suggesting that for any one particular problem, some learners adopt an abstraction approach, other learners adopt an exemplar approach. So let's turn to some of the primary evidence that we've collected for this claim. We're going to be using a function learning laboratory task. I want to go over that with you a little bit because it's going to be a foundational task that is going to be used throughout the experiments that I present today. We present the task with this cover story to try to stimulate participants to adopt a neutral stance or toward the problem, or try to understand that this may be somewhat novel and they're going to have to learn something new that maybe they haven't encountered before. The cover story is NASA scientists to figure out that for a new organism discovered on Mars, that it releases a new element, Barros, and that's related to the absorption of another new element, Zebon, but the scientists don't know how they're related. So your job is to read these computer printouts and that show different absorption levels and release levels and figure out how the absorption of Zebon is related to Barros. So participants in a trial, they will see a bar that's filled into a certain level, which provides for that particular trial the level of absorption of the new element. They then construct a response by filling in another bar, and that bar it displays or shows their prediction for how much is released of the other element. And after submitting their response, they immediately get feedback for the actual amount of release. And you can see the feedback's a graphical kind of feedback, as well as a verbal feedback that tells them precisely how many units off they are in their prediction. Over the course of training, participants see 200 trials, and these 200 trials encompass 20 different input values, 20 different stimuli input values, and these 20 different values are represented over 10 blocks. Then participants are immediately given a transfer task in which they see 30 stimuli, 30 input values outside the training range. That's the extrapolation task, and that's going to be the critical task for trying to evidence different individual differences, different approaches to solving this problem. So here's a schematic of the task. The input values are generated from a bilinear V function, and these input values that we use are shown in black here. The extrapolation values are values that are sampled from outside the training range, and they're shown in blue. Now, if participants have learned the input-output relations, the relations between changes in the stimulus input, changes in the output. If they've learned those relations, then they should be able to extrapolate pretty nicely along the function lines. And as a matter of fact, that's what we see with some subjects. Here's an actual participant from one of our experiments, and you can see that their extrapolation predictions, which are in blue here, fairly nicely follow the actual function output line. So this suggests that this particular participant has abstracted the function that's generated the points and has used that to extrapolate quite accurately. And this was the prevailing view at the time when we started work with this task, was that the way humans learn these function concepts is to extract the function rule. But there's an alternative. There's an alternative that humans might use to try to complete this task, the learning task. They might adopt an exemplar approach in which they would see a stimulus item, say, for example, 111. They learn through the course of training that that's paired with an output of 34, and they memorize that stimulus item. For a second pair, they might see the input as 87. They learn through training that the output is 39, and they memorize that pair. They see another pair, input 99. Through training, they learn that it's paired with output 18, and they learn that pair. The representation is a representation of each of these pairs, but without any information concerning the relationship of the change in the input values and the corresponding change in the output values. For this kind of representation, an exemplar representation, formal modeling, very simple exemplar model, shows that extrapolation with that kind of representation is going to be, the extrapolation values are going to be fairly near the values of the outputs for the training points at the end of this training range. So it's going to be fairly flat along here. Now, a model with a little bit of input and output generalization will curve a little bit down, but the simple model just shows an extrapolation like this. Now, you can see that there is some error, there's some deviation from this kind of extrapolation in the function, and we can objectively look at participants' error in their extrapolation from the true function. And if that error is not significantly different from that produced by the exemplar model, we can assume that those participants have acquired an exemplar representation in order to learn the task. For participants whose error in their predicted values is significantly less than the error from an exemplar model, we then infer that those participants have more of an abstraction approach and representation to the problem. So here are results from one of our studies. What you can see is that no, not everybody was an abstraction learner. About half the participants, this is the average prediction values for the participants that were categorized as abstraction learners based on their error in the extrapolation. You can see that they're extrapolating fairly nicely along the function. About another half of the participants, however, are showing extrapolation that looks very much like an exemplar representation. So from these data and other experiments where we've used the functional learning task, we think there's good evidence that on this task that many might have thought would produce abstraction learning, we're finding a fair number of participants are approaching the task through an exemplar approach and representation. Now, Others have shown this as well with different kinds of laboratory concept tasks, have gathered data to suggest that individuals are using an exemplar approach and other individuals more an abstraction approach. So there's beginning to be some convergence on this idea. The next theoretical claim ups the ante a little bit. It's a little bit more provocative. Our next theoretical claim is that the individual's tendency to focus on exemplars during their conceptual learning versus extracting an abstraction of the concept or problem solution may be relatively stable and persistent for each individual. If that's the case, then if we can identify that learning tendency, for example, in our function learning task, that would provide the basis for predicting performance for each individual on other concept tasks, very different concept tasks, for example, like category learning. But this is a bit of a stretch, that the way the individual approaches one problem is going to be pretty consistent and show up as the same approach on a very different kind of problem. To try to evaluate this claim, what we did was we had the participants who solved the functional learning task, the participants I just showed you, some weeks later participate in another experiment, you could call it another learning task, in which they're trying to categorize different machines into two categories, Morkels and Crenshaws. So let me give you an example. Here's one of the machines. It operates on land. It works to gather harmful solids. It has a shovel and it rolls on wheels. Participants have to make a guess, what kind of machine is this? Well, this is a Morkel. Here's another machine, operates on land, works to clean spilled oil, has a shovel, slides on skis. What kind of machine is this? Well, this machine happens to be a Crenshaw. Here's another machine, operates on the surface of water, works to gather harmful solids, has spongy material, rolls on wheels. What's this? This is a Crenshaw, operates on this yet another machine, operates on the surface of the water, works to clean spilled oil, has a spongy material, slides on skis. What's this? This is a Morkel. Okay, so participants get some training on a number of these machines, and then they're given a transfer task. In the transfer task, they're shown new machines that have features that are different. The features are combined in different ways than the machines that were initially presented during training. Here's an example of a transfer machine, operates on the seafloor, works to remove lost fishing nets, has a hook, swims with fins. This happens to be a Morkel. Okay, so I will say, in case you've been following along trying to figure this out, that the Morkels, the category is this. The Morkels are machines that have coherent features. They're workable machines. This machine operates on the seafloor. It works to remove lost fishing nets. It has a hook, which can grab the nets, and it swims with fins, which allows it to operate on the seafloor. Crenshaws, on the other hand, are incoherent machines. They're machines that don't work. Their features don't hang together. Here's the Crenshaw, operates on the surface of water, works to gather harmful solids, has a spongy material. That's not going to help you gather harmful solids. It rolls on wheels. That's not going to work on the surface of water. Okay, so those are the two categories. And what we did in training was present 4 Morkels, 4 coherent machines, and 4 Crenshaws. I showed you 2 of each. That set's presented 6 times. And participants get feedback as they make their responses. In transfer, we present new instances. I showed you an example of that. Some different features, different combinations of features from the training set. And without feedback, participants have to make a prediction. Is that a Morkel or a Crenshaw? Have to make a categorization. And as I've already said, these participants have already completed the functional learning task. We've categorized them as abstractors and exemplar learners based on their functional learning extrapolation patterns. Let's look at acquisition. This is the acquisition rate and performance on each training block, and what the participants identified as abstractors from the functional learning task are in blue. The participants identified as exemplar learners on the functional learning task are identified as red, is the red line. And what you can see quite clearly is that the rate of learning and the asymptotic learning, near perfect, is the same for both of these groups that are identified on the functional learning task. So this could mean one of two things. One is that the tendency for abstraction or exemplar learning on the functional learning task is irrelevant for what these individuals are trying to do in the abstract coherent category learning task. That is, these individuals are approaching that abstract coherent category task very similarly. You know, looks like it. Look at their training. Alternatively, it may be that an exemplar approach and an abstraction approach are useful for learning the training items and being able to perform near perfectly at the end. Indeed, that's the idea here, is that both approaches can be fruitful, and some individuals prefer one and other individuals prefer another. And I might just add, this might be what instructors are seeing in their classroom. Learners that are pushing for very different kinds of representations are doing equally well during homework and class discussions. But then in transfer, if transfer problems are given, you see very different representations emerge. Is that what happened here? Well, let's look at transfer performance. I want to make it very clear that in transfer, chance is 50%. If you don't know anything, you can get 50% because there are two choices you would be guessing at. So what happens? Remember, we have our 19 abstractors as identified from the functional learning task, 18 as identified from the exemplar, 18 exemplar is identified from the functional learning task. Here are their average transfer performance. Abstractors are performing significantly above chance. The mean performance is showing that they are moving toward getting that underlying abstraction. Exemplar learners, on the other hand, on average, are right at chance. Their representation doesn't give them any information, doesn't allow them to make an accurate determination on the transfer items of which category that machine belongs to. So we have predicted, and others haven't been able to do this, we have predicted a priori based on a very different function, a very different laboratory conceptual task, what learners are going to do fairly well in this task are going to abstract, and what learners are going to not do well because they're pushing toward exemplar representations. Now, an important question, and one that many of you may be thinking of, is that, well, maybe we're not, maybe this abstractor exemplar difference is really a proxy, or maybe it's a stand-in for general ability. Maybe the people with higher general ability, higher working memory, maybe they're the ones who are going to get this abstract coherent category. So we collected working memory span for all these participants. We collected Raven's progressive matrices. We had them complete that task. People consider that an index of fluid intelligence. And we examined whether those two general ability measures predicted performance on this abstract coherent category task. We're looking at transfer performance now. There's no hint that working memory capacity or fluid intelligence, as indexed by Ravens, has any bearing on how people are doing on the transfer task. On the other hand, when we add in our abstraction exemplar tendency from the function learning task, we can find that there's a fair amount of variance accounted for by that tendency on the function learning task. And it predicts significantly performance on the abstract coherent category task. Okay, in the same paper, we sampled another group of students. We had them complete the function learning task. We distinguished them as abstraction or exemplar learners. And then with an interval of more than a week, we gave them another kind of category task, a perceptual category task. This is one that these perceptual categories are used quite often in the laboratory. This one, you've got to classify these creatures into two categories, diggers and builders. You can use various rules for this. The rule that we used was an additive rule where at least 2 of 3 features have to be present. Four creatures are in one category, 4 in the other. Or these, it's possible that these stimuli could be categorized according to exemplar representations. You could learn which creature goes into which category. And the nice thing about this task is that in transfer items, each transfer item can put exemplar and abstraction processes in opposition. That is, an exemplar item might be very similar to a particular training item and be put, but not follow the rule, and thus be put in a different category from the training item. Or the item could be follow the rule, but not be similar to a particular, to the training items, and that would be put in the different category. So exemplar puts the training item in one category, rule in the other category, and you can predict how subjects are going to respond based on their function learning task. Okay, so I think we've got pretty good evidence, at least over 3 different conceptual laboratory learning tasks, that the preference toward abstraction or rule learning, abstraction and rule learning versus exemplar learning is fairly persistent. So now we're going to really make the most provocative claim. We're going to make, I should say, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. So the theoretical claim that this tendency is persistent, at least in the laboratory, is supported at least for laboratory concepts. Moving on now to our big leap, our third claim. We're going to suggest that these learning tendencies that we've identified in the laboratory with concept learning tasks in the laboratory may persist to the learner's acquisition of complex conceptual knowledge in educational settings, like science classes. That is, we're saying that the way learners approach these relatively simple laboratory concepts that they acquire in an hour or so of a laboratory task, that approach may persist into their attempts to learn complex concepts in their classes, concepts that may take several lectures, several months to acquire, that tendency persists into this learning environment. That's a really big leap. That would be pretty interesting if that were occurring. Oh, we've been exploring this possibility. In one big project, we were able to go into general chemistry and organic classrooms at Washington University. And the students in these classes were invited to take our function learning task. They did this generally right when the semester started. And out of these several years of chemistry classes, we were able to identify 627 abstractors 535 exemplar learners. So we have a healthy sample of each. Let's now first consider the work we did in the organic chemistry course. Organic chemistry is interesting because the chemical educators have suggested that organic chemistry problem solving requires more in-depth reasoning and conceptual understanding than does the problem solving that's presented to students in general chemistry. General chemistry, there's in the chem ed literature work suggesting that students can rely on memorization and be fairly successful. But in organic chemistry, the idea is if students are relying on memorization, it's going to be a very tough semester for them in terms of performing well. Okay, so we're going to look at students in organic chemistry on their exam performance. Here's average exam performance in an organic chemistry 2 course. And what you can see quite clearly is that in the reddish bar, we have the abstractors, and they're performing substantially better on the exams than the exemplar learners identified by a function learning task on the organic chemistry exams. A substantial difference, large effect. And I might say that many of these learners were classified in the previous chemistry class on the function learning task. So that tendency is persistent across a semester or a year until when they get into organic chemistry. Okay. Now, we again have to consider the idea that maybe this difference in organic chemistry has to do with general ability. That we have the math ACT scores for our abstractors in that organic chemistry course. We have the scores for the exemplar learners, and you can see there's very little difference between the 2 groups in math ACT scores. We have the composite ACT scores as well, and you can see that there's very little difference in the composite ACT averages for the abstraction learners and the exemplar learners. So this is not a general ability difference. General abilities, as indexed by ACT, are very similar for the abstractors and exemplar learners. We think that the fundamental difference is they're pushing for different ways to acquire and represent the concepts, but they're successful at that in terms of acquisition, unless the task requires some generalization or deep conceptual understanding. So we're going to actually test this prediction a little more directly. In general chemistry, we're going to examine this nuanced, and I think theoretically revealing prediction that the abstraction learners are going to fare well on problems that require an abstraction, that surface features are different from the training problems, whereas the exemplar learners are going to falter on those kinds of exam items where some transfer is required, transfer the underlying principles and concepts. Exemplar learners might do very well on exam items where the question is very similar to that seen in classroom homework. So to examine this question in chemistry, post hoc, that is, all the exams were already given, they were already constructed, and these scores had been in for a couple of years, but we had access to the exams. We, mainly the chemistry instructors, went back to the exam items, and they distinguished those as exam items that were similar to how the content had been presented in class or in homework, very similarly presented, versus exam items that were presented as problems or in context that were different from the context used in homework or during class. I will say that some problems couldn't be classified with any confidence about were they similar to what's presented in class? Were they enough different to be considered transfer? So not all of the exam items were placed in these categories that we now call retention. Initially, we called them near transfer versus transfer. We now call that, initially we call it far transfer. Terminology doesn't matter too much. I prefer retention questions, very similar to the training, or transfer questions. All right, so then after categorizing these exam items, we then rescored the, we didn't rescore the questions, we took the students' exam score and we divided it into their performance on retention questions and performance on transfer questions. And here are the results. As I've already said, the advantage of abstractors, if it's a persistent tendency from the function learning task, should be limited to transfer exam items. That's exactly what happens. This is from the fall of our Chem 1, General Chem 1 class. You can see our near transfer here on the left, that the abstractors in the reddish orange bars are performing not much above, not significantly better than the exemplar learners. And by contrast, on the transfer questions, what we call then far transfer, the abstractors are performing significantly better than the exemplar learners, and that's a statistically significant interaction. We also replicated it in the fall 2014 class. The near transfer, the abstractors and the exemplar learners. Again, I call these retention questions now. Very similar to what was used in training. They don't differ. Performance is high, they don't differ. But on far transfer, once again, you can see the abstractors are performing significantly better than the exemplar learners. Again, a reliable interaction. Now, again, we need to ask the question, are we just picking up ability differences that are indexed in the standard usual ways we've been doing for 30 to 40 years? And the answer is no. If we look at composite ACT scores, the abstractors are just a teeny bit better on average than exemplar learners. Really nothing, no substantial difference there. And then we had access in the general chemistry class. We had many more students in there to the scientific reasoning subscale of the ACT for some of the students, not all of them. And we were able to look at averages for the scientific reasoning portion, thinking that, well, maybe the transfer problems put more demands on scientific reasoning, and the students higher in that skill level are the ones who are performing better on transfer. We didn't find, though, that the abstraction learners were substantially better, just minimally better than the exemplar learners in terms of scientific reasoning. Again, we think that the fundamental distinction is between how they're approaching the construction and representation of their concepts, how they're approaching their learning in these chemistry classes via abstraction or exemplar representations. Okay, well, that's pretty interesting. Those are pretty interesting results, but with some limitations. First of all, the chemistry exam items have problems that require some quantitative, almost all of them require some quantitative kinds of work and reasoning. The function learning task is basically a quantitative task. So maybe it's this overlap in the necessity for some quantitative skills that's producing the relation between the function learning task and the chemistry performance. Maybe this is not a general kind of situation where the tendency in the laboratory function learning task is going to help us predict how students do in the say science classrooms. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to look at a different discipline that relies more on conceptual problem solving, maybe, and not so much on quantitative procedures to solve the exam problems. Secondly, the exam items in the chemistry were categorized post hoc as retention or transfer. And maybe because we're asking the chemistry instructors to fill those categories with items they shoehorned items into those categories in ways that aren't quite what we would want. What you'd really like to see is you'd like to see the exams designed a priori to have retention and transfer items. And then thirdly, at WashU, I have to say chemistry now is taught in a more interactive way. I think many classrooms are going to more interactive instruction, more classroom discussion, probing questions that are discussed and so on to try to get at conceptual understanding. Back in 2012 and 14, they were not, they were more standard lecture format. It could be the case that as our instructional techniques and emphasis orients more toward active learning techniques to get students to wrestle with underlying concepts and principles, it may be that this persistence and abstraction versus exemplar tendencies drops out, and basically the instructional approach creates a more uniform kind of learning for the students in the classroom. So to try to get some information about those questions and extend beyond the limits of the chemistry project, we got together with colleagues at the University of Georgia who teach first and second semester introductory biology courses. And we were particularly, well, the instructors who were implementing an array of active learning techniques were the ones interested in collaborating with us. So the two instructors were completely committed to classes that had a lot of interactivity. They frequently interrupted their lectures with questions that students answered via note cards or the electronic response systems, questions that probe students' understanding. Students could work in informal groups to consider these questions, and the instructors would lead, walk around and discuss with some of these small groups the information and concepts, and they also brought the class back together in large group discussions. But there's a lot of interactivity in these classrooms. Now, another important feature is that 4 midterm exams were constructed purposefully to include 2 kinds of questions. We worked with the instructors and asked them if they would construct items on the exam that we would consider retention questions. These items are very similar to how the material was covered in classroom homework. And we asked the instructors to construct for each exam at least 5 items that used that depended on learned material, but the situation or problem in the question was differently from all previous presentations. So for example, for a particular kind of evolutionary pressure, the instructors may have illustrated this with phenotypes of snakes. The exam item was about the genotypes of butterflies. The question had to do with the very same evolutionary pressure, but it changed somewhat to include a different species, and it changed somewhat to look at the genotype underlying phenotypes. So we consider those transfer items. Now, we also collected the students' ACTs, and we had them all complete the Raven's progressive matrices, again, as an index of fluid intelligence. And I'll show you that they don't differ, but also that when we put them in as a covariate, and we've done this with other experiments too, I just didn't talk about that. When we put them in as a covariate on exam performance with the abstractor and exemplar tendency, which we were able to identify from students completing the function learning task at the outset of the semester, we find that, again, the abstraction students are now in the gray bar, the exemplar learners in the white bar. These are the retention items, the left part of the graph figure, and what you find is no difference. Looks just like our chemistry performance in a very different kind of discipline with exams that are constructed a priori with retention questions, no difference. But for the transfer items, you find a significant and large advantage for the abstraction learners versus the retention learners. And I'd like to point out that in this particular experiment, you find that the change in levels of performance from retention to transfer for the abstraction learners is very slight. And this is something that you might expect. If the learner, abstraction learner, is acquiring the underlying principle of the concept, underlying concept, then they should be able to solve the transfer problems pretty well. And they do here. On the other hand, it's for the exemplar learners that you see the drop in performance from retention to transfer. It's limited to the exemplar learners. And this, I think, reflects almost exactly the instructor's comments that I noted at the outset, that there's some group of students that seem to fare very well on exam items that are similar to what's presented in class and homework, but they start to falter when that concept or principle is now dressed up or presented in a different context. We think it's because these are learners who persist and have a tendency to build their concepts through memorizing the examples that are given to illustrate the concept. Okay, we were concerned a little bit that, well, maybe the differences I showed you are due to just one exam. It's not the case. If we look at performance for each of the 4 exams, you see that on retention items, there's no difference between the abstractors and the exemplar learners. You move over to the transfer items. Now, if we look at the transfer items, you see a consistent difference between abstractors and exemplar learners, with abstractors performing better than the exemplar learners. And finally, as promised, here are the ability scores for the abstractors and exemplar learners. Now, the ACT scores are not as high as at WashU. We figure WashU is a private selective institution. Georgia is a public institution. The ACT scores are going to be lower, and they are. The point is that they're not different appreciably between abstraction and exemplar learners. And for the Raven's progressive matrices, there's no appreciable difference either between abstraction and exemplar learners. And I will say it was kind of interesting that if you look at the Raven's progressive matrice interaction with the retention and transfer items, there is an interaction, but it goes in the direction that's opposite from the interaction with abstraction and exemplar learners. That is, for Raven's progressive matrices, as people got better on that, they tended to do better on the retention problems than people were worse on the Raven's progressive matrices. Whereas for transfer problems, the slope was pretty flat, so that it didn't matter where you were on Raven's progressive matrices, performance on transfer is about the same. So even when these ability measures are thrown in, and they might account for some performance, at least in this particular case, it wasn't the direction that the abstraction exemplar interaction is going. Okay. So, well, we have tried this in a couple other classrooms. My colleague, Mike Masson at the University of Victoria, I somehow talked him into giving the function learning task in his class, and he generated questions that he called generalization or retention questions. And sure enough, we're getting the same pattern. The N was not big enough. His class was not big enough. This is preliminary, but it's still in line with what I've already showed you, now in yet a different discipline. For the generalization questions, the abstraction learners, their blue bars, that's somewhat better than the exemplar learners. And for retention questions, now the exemplar learners are a little bit better than abstractors. And some have suggested to me that that's what you might expect if exemplar learners are really focusing on memorizing examples. Abstraction learners not quite as much. Maybe on items on the exam that are just like what's shown in class, the exemplar learners might do a little better. Anyway, this, these are just nominal differences. I'm not trying to make too much of this, other than to say that it's kind of suggestive. Okay, so let's take stock. I wanted to talk for about 50 minutes, and I think I did that. And then we want to open things up for questions. I'll be glad to field any questions. First of all, individual differences are present in laboratory conceptual tasks. Some learners try to solve the problem or the concept problem with exemplar-based approaches, resulting in those kinds of representations. Other learners are pushing to extract the underlying principle or rule. Secondly, we showed that this tendency tends to persist across very different kinds of laboratory concepts: a function learning task, an abstract coherent category task, a perceptual categorization task. Thirdly, I've just shown you that this learner's tendency can be evidenced. The learner's tendency on laboratory tasks appears to extend to classroom learning. So we were able to predict student performance of different kinds of exam questions based on how students approached a laboratory task with content that's very different from that they were trying to learn in their classrooms. This wasn't accounted for by general ability. And finally, I think the potential instructional applications are provocative and perhaps important. We could identify, these results suggest we could identify students at the outset of a course before they even sit down in the first class, or you could do it the first week. Identify those students as having abstraction tendencies or exemplar tendencies. And we might then be able to implement interventions for those students early on in the class that would try to promote or move those students toward representations that are better suited to our educational objectives. I think most of us it would be abstraction, sometimes maybe it wouldn't be. And this is important because what instructors tell me in the chemistry class especially, and I think in biology, is that if students are working hard and over the first 3 or 4 weeks, they're really putting a lot into the class. And at that first exam, they flounder, they don't do so well. Students become discouraged. They may start to disengage from the class. They spend less time on the class. And by then it may be, I mean, you've identified the students out that first exam are struggling, by then it may be too late. If we could anticipate who those students were at the outset of the classroom, we could maybe utilize resources to intervene. Now, you're probably going to ask me, how could we do that? And I have to say, I don't know. One idea is, well, one kind of thing that we use at WashU in chemistry is peer-led team learning, PLTL, in which students get together into small groups. They discuss how to approach a problem, what concepts are useful, what principles are useful. The peer mentor does not give them the answer, isn't pushing for the right answer, is pushing for the students to discuss underlying concepts. And the thinking is, well, maybe that's pushing students away toward representations that are learn a problem and its answer, and more toward more toward learning the underlying principles. We were able in our chemistry data to look at students, both exemplar and abstraction learners, who were in peer-led team learning and not. And what we found was, yes, we got an increase in exam performances for students who were in peer-led team learning, but that increase was greater for the abstraction learners and the exemplar learners. So in a sense, that intervention is aligning with what the abstraction learners are wanting to do, and helps them enhance that understanding even more. So one could still try that, but that didn't seem to be especially selective. Maybe one could use these productive failures, where you give students a problem that leads them toward a failure that illustrates a conceptual misunderstanding, and then students that conceptual misunderstanding becomes salient. Maybe this would help exemplar learners push more for understanding the underlying concepts. I don't know. We don't have any data on that. Those are very speculative, and so I'll end with that, and then I'll open it up to questions. I do want to thank our funding support from the James S. McDaniel Foundation and NIMH for work on our laboratory concepts. The Luce Foundation helps support our work in chemistry. And I've had a number of excellent, wonderful collaborators in chemistry: Mike Cahill, Megan Dosbach, Gina Fry. And Mike and Gina have been a collaborator throughout this process, even working on our biology project with my colleagues at Georgia, Paula Lemons and Lisa Lemary, who's now at Texas A&M. And thank you. Thanks very much. Beatrice, should I now not share my screen, or what would you like me to do?
I think that would be nice, so we can see you in bigger. And if we need to go back to the slides, you can, reshare. So thank you so much, Mark. This has been really interesting. And there's lots of clapping hands in the audience, and there have also already been some questions posed. And also some compliments have been posted in the questions. So, for example, Janet McDaniel posted that these organic chemistry results are super interesting and that she's really glad to see you applying these ideas to classroom learning in a meaningful way. And so,
Lost the volume.
Do you hear us?
Okay.
Do you hear me now?
I do have it now. Thank you. I accidentally. Okay, great. Thank you.
So yeah, lots of clapping and thank yous. And also your talk generated an interest and questions from the beginning on, and there's also already some raised hands, and I see you. I will call on you. We'll first go to some of the questions that were posed earlier in the talk. The first one was by Robert Bjork, and this was when you were showing your V-shaped function that in your basic task participants have to learn. And so Robert Bjork's reaction to that was that this is really something odd from anybody's real world experience, that kind of function. And so and then there have also been other questions. So for example, Julia Groß asks, how do you know if the exemplar learners, whether they really are exemplar learners or whether they are just applying some other function that they maybe misconceived there. And there was also another question in here about this dichotomy. So is it really just two groups, or could there be like a meaningful third group, people who just misperceive the function, for example? That could be a third group. So can you say a bit more about that? How do you pick that function for that task? And why do you think that task, the way it is, helps you to ideally distinguish exemplar learners and abstraction learners?
Yeah, those are great questions. So first of all, that was the idea, was to try to come up with a function that would not be really closely aligned with people's real world experience, because the possible problem there is that people would bring their prior learned experience into this problem. And regardless of whether they had an abstraction approach or exemplar approach, they could then solve the problem based on prior experience. And in fact, that's also why we use this Mars cover story, to try to give a hint or set the stage that students might be learning something new that wasn't like their experience on Earth. So that's why we did that. So how do we know that the learners just don't have that they're maybe using an extrapolation rule that's different from those who we're calling abstractors? Well, it's a really good question. And one thing I can say about that is, if that's the case, then what you ought to find is that maybe when you tell those exemplar learners you really need to learn an underlying abstraction, maybe they would be able, maybe then they could show you some extrapolation. And we don't find that. And so, I mean, I guess maybe they could be doing the same extrapolation rule, but we say, listen, that we give them another problem. It's a different kind of function, say an inverted V. And we say, it really would be best. These points are related. It would really be best if you found how these points are related and try to abstract some sort of rule behind them. And some of them do that. And then they start to extrapolate along the function. I have to say some of them don't. And they're still extrapolating flat. So it suggests that if you change the representation, their extrapolation will change. And this is true for abstractors even more. So if you tell abstractors, look, the best way to do this is just to memorize those input-output training points. And when you tell abstractors that on another problem, most of them are showing flat extrapolation. So it's not necessarily that there's an extrapolation that they like, it's that the extrapolation seems to follow the representations that we've pushed them to adopt. But that's a good question. That's a good question. And then, is there a third group? There could be.
Fourth.
And I'll say this, I didn't stress at all that in order to make our classification of exemplar versus abstraction, learners have to learn well those training points. The only learners whose error is very low, we have a particular cutoff, are carried on throughout our experiments. If they haven't learned those points well, extrapolation is all over the place. You can't tell really what the representation is. Is this a third group that's doing something different? We don't know. I can tell you this, that if we look at the speed of their key presses during training, if we look at their output responses during training, the speed is very fast. The output responses aren't variable. Sometimes it's exactly the same response. We think some of those learners, a fair number of what we call non-learners, are just not trying that hard. But it could be that there's also some of them that are doing something a little bit different. So that's a good point. We definitely in every experiment, we have not been able to classify all learners for that reason. So there could be this third group. I don't know what that would be right now. I'm not sure what that would be.
All right.
Thank you. Good question.
So there's another question that's actually an anonymous question, so it's going to be a little bit more critical. That I think relates well to this, because the question here is, so you put learners into the abstraction exemplar category based on one task, and then look to see whether that categorization helped predict performance on a new task. Did you consider how the individuals might be categorized based on only the new task and see whether they were consistent across the two tasks?
No, we haven't done that. So on the Morkels and Crenshaws, we could do that. You could do the reverse. I don't know why that wouldn't work, but we haven't done that. We haven't done that.
Then there's also the question in here, like basically to provide more evidence for your claim that the individuals are actually consistent. And this question came up somewhere else, whether people are the same type of learner for different types of subjects, which I think you propose they should be.
Well, okay. So here's the complete answer. These are all really good questions. We've, in data that we haven't published in the big chemistry project, we administered the functional learning task several times, once at the beginning of their college career, and then maybe a year later at another chemistry course, and sometimes 3 times later. Sometimes 3 times with different kinds of functions. And what we find is that there's a group of students who consistently showed an exemplar learning tendency across those 2 years. There's a group that consistently shows an abstraction learning tendency. There's a third group, and they'll show one tendency one time and another tendency another time, and maybe even flip back. So we really think that what you have is you have a group that's strongly persistent in exemplar learning, a group that's strongly persistent in abstraction, and probably a group that's more, I would say, opportunistic, that's more affected by the demands of the task, or more affected perhaps by whether they're succeeding in abstraction, and if they find the task is too hard, they can resort to exemplar learning. And there's some kind of testimonials to that. So as we're talking about this over the past 10 years in our educational research group with social cognitive psychologists and educators, one really great biologist said, well, you know, in physics, I admit I wasn't getting those underlying principles very quickly. I memorized the problems. That's the way I got through physics. So some learners are going to be more flexible, in the laboratory task. My former postdoc, Jerry Little, who's now at California State East Bay, did an experiment in which we classified people as exemplar or abstraction learners, and then we put them in a categorization task in which there were 4 examples per category or 24 examples per category. And what we found, so the subjects are a little more flexible. With 4 examples per category, they may tend to memorize those examples. That's pretty easy. With 24 examples per category, a very demanding task for memorization, so they might push for abstraction. And that's exactly what we found, was that some did that. Some push for exemplar learning in the 4 item per category, others push, and then they would push for abstraction learning 24 items. But there were some learners, some exemplar learners persisted in the exemplar approach, according to our transfer items, for 4 or 24 per category. And some abstraction learners persisted in their abstraction approach, regardless of whether they're 4 items per category or 24 items per category. So again, I would say I think there are some learners who are more sensitive to the affordances of the task and may adopt an approach that fits that. But we think there are some segment of learners, and I can't give you a percentage, that's pretty persistent in wanting to approach things through exemplar memorization, and other learners who are pretty persistent in wanting to push for abstraction. And look, I'm not saying that that's going to happen all the time in every case. In fact, I think there are some concept problems that are so easy, the rule's so easy, we can think of those, conjunctive rules, that most people are going to learn the rule. And there may be some cases where there are 3 or 4 salient examples, and the underlying rules are not so clear, people are going to learn the example. I don't disagree with that. That's the case. I think that's absolutely the case. I'm speaking more to concepts where if they're not so easy, and there may be these alternative approaches that for one learner or another is more or less acceptable or amenable. And it's those kinds of problems. Like the function learning task is not an easy task. You have to have students who are motivated to finish that up. That's really hard. That's not a fun task. Learning scientific concepts in the classroom, that's not necessarily a fun task. That's a tough task. And it's on these tasks where you might find that students might adopt one approach or another, and that it might be kind of persistent for them.
So that brings us back to the odd V-shaped function being good for that reason, because it's a task where not everyone will get it, and it will show who can. Yeah.
If you give a linear function, almost everybody's going to get it. It's pretty clear. There's that. But yes, that's exactly right. Good point.
And this taps into another comment that we have, and so you talked about that it can be dynamic. It can vary with the demands of the task. Would you say that it's a continuum? Would you even go that far, or you don't know?
I don't know if it's a continuum. I don't know how to define this obviousness or salience, but I think some problems the solution's pretty salient one way or another. And other problems you have to dig in a little bit. It takes some work. And I don't know how to define those, but I think it's the problems where you have to dig in, and it takes some work. It takes some consideration and some thoughtfulness and some effort. I think it's for those tasks that you'll find that some people may prefer to orient toward the examples and others toward the abstraction.
And if we move away from the continuum to the meaningful categories, can you put about percentages on the number of exemplar and abstraction learners, or have you found this to be pretty consistent also across like your WashU and your University of Georgia samples and across different subjects?
Yeah, we mostly have done this with WashU students, and we find it in the laboratory and when we're assessing the functional learning task in the classroom, where we have to do online and we get more non-learners, they just don't dig in as much. We find that it's about half and half there. One interesting thing is this. I didn't make anything of this at all during the talk, but there were about half and half as we entered introductory chemistry. By the time you get to organic chemistry, you may have noticed it was not half and half. 80 were abstractors, 30 students were exemplar learners. So it wasn't half and half at all. It was about, 3/4, 1/4 approximately. would suggest that, now that doesn't mean the student population didn't have half and half, but that suggests that as the students went through more demanding chemistry courses that were required more conceptual understanding, the exemplar learners were dropping out. I mean, they were. Now we're down to only 30. We have 80 abstractors, where in general chemistry it was more even. So it at least at WashU, it's maybe 40, 60, but as the students, as the composition of the students of the more advanced courses may not look like that. And I think that also offers us an opportunity, to the extent that this task is useful in identifying those persistent exemplar learners, for those who want to stay chemistry majors and stay in STEM. Wouldn't it be great if we could identify some interventions that would push those learners, if we could, toward trying to also represent underlying principles to allow them to fare better and persist in these STEM courses? I mean, I think that's kind of inclusivity and equity in order to address those students' need. I think it's a unique need. I'm not saying everybody's going to fall into that category at all, but there is some portion of students who do, and you can't determine them necessarily based on your general achievement scores or your fluid intelligence scores. So if we can identify them this way and we can intervene, I think that's the thing that's kind of exciting. We can't do it now. You can't ask a chemistry instructor who's going to succeed in your class and who isn't, but we can give them some ideas about who might and why. That's the thing. I mean, the instructors already know there are these students who can't answer the transfer problems. They don't know why. They don't know what to do. They think the students are not. They think the students are, I hate to say it, not smart or stupid. No, I'm not saying that. These students are working hard. They're just persisting in an approach that gives them a representation that can be very useful, but not for transfer problems. So it gives a completely different cast or interpretation on why these students are struggling, and one that gives instructors more understanding as to what they might do to help these students. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that this is going to apply to every student, and that there aren't other factors that make a difference. I'm saying I think this is a factor that's really important that has not been appreciated and has been maybe overlooked.
And you made it very clear that it's something different than general ability. And this was also a question that came up quite early in the talk, and then you addressed it in the talk. There was, Paul Madsen had just a clarification question on the intelligence relations that you presented. So was it that fluid intelligence did predict performance for rule abstractors, but not for exemplar learners? Is that correct?
No, I didn't make that very clear. Mm-hmm. If we just look at the fluid intelligence relations with the retention and transfer problems, there is an interaction, but it goes in the opposite direction that the abstractor exemplar interaction went in. I can't explain it, but it's interesting that fluid intelligence doesn't predict the pattern we found with abstractors exemplar learners, which is that you might think higher fluid intelligence are going to do better on the transfer problems. Lower fluid intelligence is going to show decrement in transfer performance and maybe no relation on retention problems. It was just the opposite. I don't know why. It may be somewhat spurious, but the point is that the fluid intelligence isn't at all overlapping in terms of its accommodation for our interaction patterns, not at all with the pattern that the abstraction exemplar learner gives you for retention and transfer questions. So I thought that was pretty interesting. That it's not fluid intelligence.
Definitely is. So there have been some doubters, and I'm sure that this is one doubt that you are confronted with a lot, and you've already acknowledged it too, which is that WashU tends to be very selective in its student population, and the ACT of 33 is the 98th percentile. Somebody posted, I don't know if that's exactly true, but it's very high. So, and so Andrew Conway, who doubted this, also said that even the Georgia State ones, or was it Georgia University, are also still high ACT scores. So do you have any?
That's true.
Are you sure that this is not like maybe just a relation that's missing in these in this student population?
It could be. It's a great question, and it could be. So the Luce Foundation funded a multi-institutional study that we did, where we got functional learning, and there were some institutions where the ACTs were lower, and these were open enrollment institutions. And I have to say that mostly we were saying more exemplar learners in those cases, many more exemplar learners and abstractors in those cases. So it could be at the low end of ACT, it could be that what you're picking up is a lot of exemplar learners, or you could put it another way, maybe lower ability is pushing people toward that, or maybe abstraction orientation requires a little bit more ability. There are a number of different ways you could put it. But yes, I think at those lower ends, say, of the ACT, that maybe there's a more intimate relationship between exemplar learning and the, you might say, lower general ability. I think that's possible. And now, I mean, the open admission institutions we're looking at were small, so we didn't have a lot of them, but that seemed to be the tendency. But I think it's interesting. So yes, okay. But I think it's interesting when you get up to the higher ACT regions, where you might think, okay, now we've got pretty able students. Aren't they almost all going to be abstractors? And the answer is no. And so what that says to me is that on some of these general achievement tests, they can be accomplished well with exemplar representations, learning and committing to memory a lot of knowledge. And in fact, that's not necessarily at odds with these very powerful exemplar models that are popular in the literature. Now, they can accomplish quite a bit. So I think the idea is that these high general ability doesn't necessarily mean these students are going to be learning as you think they're learning, that they're capturing the abstraction in a way that you, as the instructor, have captured that abstraction. Not necessarily. They may be forming a very different representation than you believe that they might. And even at those high ability levels, we find a nice proportion of students who we think are doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This was also a question that you just answered, another question that came up, which was, so Denise Wu put it, what are exemplar learners good for? But so there is something useful behind this. It just means they're learning in a different way. Somebody else also said this, that well, if they're as intelligent as abstraction learners, the exemplar learners, then and abstraction learners are better at some tasks, what you're looking at here. So education seems to be geared toward them more, or science education. But so there probably are other tasks where exemplar learners will excel.
That's a great point. And so we've speculated, we've suggested sometimes, well, maybe if you're an operator at a nuclear power plant, no, you don't want to generalize too much. Generalization in terms of the readouts and so on, they could be dangerous. Maybe you want to stick to particular examples, input, stimulus, meaning a particular thing. It may be that their exemplar representation is very useful. I don't know enough about how they operate, but one could make the argument in some cases, generalization is going to be inappropriate, and it's going to lead you to make decisions that could be very dire in some cases. So that's an excellent point. And we really we've been thinking about, we haven't done much with it or really pushed hard in the laboratory about tasks where exemplar learning might actually be advantageous and we could find superior performance. People have commented on that, and we just have not been able to identify and construct something in the laboratory where we might be able to explore that.
Just the thought that I have right now is, what if there is no function? Mm-hmm. And if you're trying to learn, if you're trying to put a function into it, and when it really is an erratic distribution, and so you need to just learn it. Well, I don't know what the real world example of that would be.
That's really an interesting point. So that's a neat thing. Beatrice, maybe we can talk about that after, about a collaboration. But anyway, I could think of a number of things, and one would be that the exemplar learners may learn faster. It's in their wheelhouse. Abstraction learners may struggle more because they're trying to find that function. And according to some of Lewandowski and his colleagues' work, these abstractors might, he doesn't say abstractors, but he talks about function learning as piecewise linear functions, assembling piecewise linear functions. Maybe, depending on how random it is, but maybe people would identify some fairly good but not precise piecewise linear functions to accommodate that. Be interesting, they might try to push that scattered mess into some sort of function, or they may give up and they may eventually start to work toward an exemplar memorization procedure. But that's really an interesting idea, super idea.
So I want to pick up one more ability idea. Jonathan Gottstein asked whether you've presented for like working memory and intelligence measures, but so they say, do exemplar learners have better memory? And I assume they mean episodic memory.
It's a great question. I don't know. Let me tell you a little bit more about the working memory. That's kind of interesting. So in the initial laboratory paper, we found that working memory was moderately related to this exemplar abstraction distinction. When we dug a little more, what we found was very interesting. Was working memory differences didn't have any prediction on the exemplar learner's learning rate, but working memory capacity did have some bearing on abstraction learners' performances, with higher working memory producing better performance, associated with better performance of abstraction learners. And that makes sense if you feel that, if you figure that with a higher working memory capacity, you could consider in working memory 2 or 3 of these input-output points in concert, and think about how, as one input-output is changing, the other input-output is changed. So that makes some sense, but it doesn't. But there's still some abstraction learners whose working memory capacity isn't all that great. It just slows them down a little bit. So yes, there's a modest relationship there. When you accommodate that statistically, it doesn't change our patterns. But I think an interesting thing is the working memory isn't associated with the exemplar learning rates, but it is more with the abstraction learning rates. But now you're asking, what about a long-term episodic? What about a task where you could look at encoding and retention of episodes over a longer period of time, not working memory? Maybe you would find, I don't know, you would find that maybe that's a little bit superior for the exemplar learners. I will say this, again, I'm sorry, it's just an observation, there's nothing empirical about it, but I do know that the instructors that we talk with, some of them will say to me, I don't want to memorize exemplars. It's too hard. Abstractions make it easier to get the information and summarize it, which is why we think initially we thought that maybe abstraction learning was a predominant thing that humans did. So it could be, it could be that the abstraction learners are those who say, it's just too hard to memorize all those examples. I'm going to find an easier way, which is for them abstraction. So it could be. I don't know. It's a great question. Be neat to examine.
All right. So now we have some people in the audience raising their hand, like it's a virtual hand, so it's not tired yet. And first is Alice Healy.
Alice. Hi, Alice.
I hope we can hear you now. You're still muted though.
Hi, Mark. It was an amazing talk, and you have amazing data, and I just want to start off by saying that my simplest question, I have a number of questions, but I might not be able to ask them all, is just you've ruled out very effectively that intelligence and even the Ravens test can't predict the performance, but what about motivation? Did you rule that out?
Oh, that's a really good question, Alice. Here's what I think. I don't think the difference between abstractors and exemplar learners is a motivational difference, because if we look at those students' performances versus our non-learners, I don't have the slide, I'm sorry, but the exemplar learners tend to perform a little better in class than our non-learners on the function learning task. So I think the motivational component for us, the major one, is between those who do the function learning task and complete it and try hard on it. We think those are the more motivated learners in our samples. And the ones that are less motivated are the ones who don't even try on the task and they don't learn. And then when we look at the classroom performance, they're the ones who don't seem to be doing as well. So I don't think, I mean, I think motivation plays a role for sure in performance on these things, but I think it's playing a role in segmenting our non-learners from our learners. I think the exemplar and abstraction participants are the ones who are really, really motivated in the experiment, and I think in the classroom. But that's a great question. You could look at it in more depth, and we haven't.
Can I ask another thing? Oh, okay, great. In that function learning task, first of all, I wondered, just as Beatrice did, whether that is a unique task in terms of its ability to predict. You have these other two ones, one on a categorization of machines and the other perceptual categories. And I wonder if they could predict, or any other task could predict as well. And also for that function learning task, you used you tested them on points that were outside the range of that V, but that were new. But you could also teach them new things that were inside the range, but not ones that they had seen before. Have you done that? And with
Yes,
that,
yes. In
and-
other words, interpolation points.
interpolation, right?
Yes, our tests always include interpolation points, half a dozen of those. I didn't report those because it turns out that interpolation is very good for both exemplar and abstraction learners. And it turns out that exemplar models do very well on interpolation. If exemplar model has no generalization around the input points or output points, then they don't do so well. But with just a little bit of generalization, the exemplar models do really, really well on the interpolation points. So Alice, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's another potentially interesting point. If our exams in classrooms are questions that are kind of interpolation questions, the exemplar model does very well on those. They're not going to distinguish between the students with exemplar representations tending to be more exemplar and those students tended to be more abstraction. It's the extrapolation points that really seem to matter. And I will say, look, I don't believe that the representations are pure necessarily. The abstraction learners are going to have some indication, some probably memory of some exemplars. So making the distinction more extreme than it probably is, I think it's a tendency that's there, but I think the representations don't have to be crystal clear, pure abstraction. I mean, the exemplar learners may have some hypotheses about a function that's not working and they don't like it and it's not helping them solve the task. So, but so interpolation, no, that doesn't really distinguish. The other task, you could try it. I mean, for the abstract coherent categories, that might be one, but I mean, not everybody's learning that. Even the abstraction, some of them, and I have the distribution, some of them tail more toward chance. And so for those abstraction, we think they're abstraction learners, but maybe they're just not, maybe they're pushing for the abstraction. They just don't quite have what it is that makes up a Morkel and a Crenshaw. So, I mean, in a sense, they could fail, but still have the abstraction. And in the function learning, I guess that's true too, but I will tell you this, that in the function learning task, there are some who we classify as function learners who extrapolate along a jigsaw, a sawtooth, so kind of sign. So we show a V function, they extrapolate by continuing along in, well, you can't see, oh, let's see, can you see? They continue along like this. We don't, there's high error, but we classify those as abstraction learners, suggesting that they've abstracted a fairly regular function that makes sense given what was in training. So even when, so we can look at those, and even though the error rate is high, we can say we think they're abstractors. And the Morkels and Crenshaws, we wouldn't have that opportunity. For the perceptual category task, again, sometimes it's a little in the middle about some subjects accepting both items, not accepting. Some subjects using similarity as a basis for the transfer, some subjects and the same subject using abstraction on other instances. So it may be that those just, they don't quite give us the behavioral separation we would like to see. But in theory, yeah, you ought to be able to use those tasks. I agree, we haven't done it. a good point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. And I might point out that Alice and Lyle, Lyle Bourne just passed away, in skilled learning, they had some very nice studies showing a difference between learners who seemed to be relying on instance-based memorization and learners who were relying more on abstraction. So I would like to acknowledge Alice's work in that regard. And we take that as work outside of what we've done to converge with some of our own.
So next I called on Robert Bjork, who had raised his hand for quite a while too, and also has some open questions in the discussion. So we'll give him a chance to ask you directly.
Yeah, Bob, I think you already asked a question, didn't you?
I did. I got my one question in, but but I did suggest that maybe there's so many good questions that it'd take a lot of your time, but I would really be really interested if there's some way to post your answers to all the questions that we didn't get. But do you think there's similarities in motor skills?
Oh boy, what a good question. Gosh.
Because I mean, I've had some experience where it looks like people, you know, in this sport, maybe golf or something, you can't rotate the hands, but that doesn't matter as much in baseball. You know, like, I don't know, it's maybe too broad a question at this late point.
Okay, well, first of all, you're as aware as anybody that some of the major theory has to do with developing motor schemata. And,
Right.
and maybe we could consider those abstractions. And maybe
Yep.
that's what we do for even a particular task in golf or baseball or so on. I guess I would ask you, what would an exemplar representation look like in the motor skill learning? What would that exactly look like? Do you think?
Really good, a really good question. I think it would amount to what you sometimes see at the very beginning, particularly with little kids. They move something exactly like some toy they have or something like. I mean, it's a little. I would need to take too much time to elaborate that, but I'm not really sure. Yeah. But I just have this broad feeling that something very similar is happening, and you know, athletes in different professional sports then get very enthusiastic about other sports after they retire, and you know, like hockey players want to play golf, and you know, I don't know whether these are because of specific transfers or what. But anyway, your work's really relevant to all kinds of instruction and so on. So
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it.
Great, thank you. I'll call on the other raised hands in a little bit. I do want to go back to, there's a lot of open questions, and I think you could write a book answering them, but also a lot of, they converge on some common questions. And one of them is about the development of these two types, and whether you know anything, like does one appear earlier, or does this change from child to adulthood, and then also with aging? So could you comment on that?
This is a great question, and we've done a little work on that, not published too much of it, but Jerry Little, who was Bob Bjork's PhD student at UCLA, I should mention, and a postdoc with me, she did get into work with 7th and 8th graders, and she found with one of the categorization tasks where you can put transfer items in opposition for exemplar versus rule learning, she found that with 7th and 8th graders a similar thing. Some of them tended to show in transfer more of a reliance on similarity, that is exemplar learning, and others seem to show more of a reliance on abstraction. So she was able to show that, reported some of those data in a translational psychological science and translation, something like that, in AP journal. But then in the upper age range, my student Reshma Gorvajala and Chris Walheim, who were at WashU, they worked with older adults on these tasks, and a similar kind of thing. yeah, we weren't sure. We wondered, well, except older adults, maybe with lowering fluid intelligence, of course, we don't think that matters. Maybe they resort to exemplar learning, or maybe memorizing is too hard for them, so they're really going to push for abstraction. We still found some individual differences in responding one way or another, abstraction versus exemplar learning. So we think you can see it along the entire developmental range. I mean, I don't know lower than 7th or 8th grade, but how does it develop? That's a great question. And one idea might be that I talked about affordances test, that some students may, for whatever reason, find that the exemplar learning it's easier for them, and so they persist with that, and that's what they rely on. That's their go-to as they're going through the educational system. And others find abstraction maybe a little easier and do that. The other thing could be, it could depend on instructors. So my colleague Gina Fry in chemistry says, I don't mean to offend any high school chemistry instructors, but she said, I think in high school chemistry, a lot of the emphasis on memorization of the particular aspects to chemistry. So it may be in certain classes that students get pushed toward, say, exemplar learning, and then some of them persist in that. So it could be experiential. Other idea is that maybe we've got some preliminary work, and we just now got a grant to really do this more effectively and with more subjects, more participants, is that different neural systems, regions are responsible for abstraction. I mean, everybody thinks it's probably anterior frontal. We have a very preliminary evidence for that with fMRI, whereas the exemplar learning, maybe it's the medial temporal areas that are responsible for mediating that kind of learning. So we're doing an fMRI study where we're hoping to find those distinctions. Now, if that's true, it could be because your choice of a strategy then recruits certain neural areas. On the other hand, it could be, we know there are individual differences in the richness of different neural systems. It could be that abstraction learners, their anterior frontal areas are much more rich and interconnected, bushy, if you will. And so for those learners, that system's easier to recruit and sustain and support their performance. For exemplar learners, maybe at least some of them, these medial temporal areas are more interconnected and robust. So those areas are easier to recruit for those learners, perhaps. So that could say that there's some underlying neural push toward one or the other. So one thing that we hope to do, don't steal this idea, that's what we're going to be doing, is that we can identify our learners as exemplar abstraction. Then we can, in another task, instruct them to use another approach. So if we instruct the exemplar learners to use abstraction approach, are they going to show ready recruitment of those anterior frontal areas? On the other hand, are the abstraction learners, if we tell them to use exemplar learning, they're going to show ready recruitment of the medial temporal area? If in fact those two, if we can find initially those two systems differentiate. If they do, then it's kind of a strategy choice that can recruit those areas. If on the other hand, they have real trouble with that, they're not seeing good distinctive recruit of those areas, it could mean these underlying neural systems differences that could be put. And I know that's pretty extreme and going pretty far beyond what we know now, but that's a speculation I've been entertaining for a while now, is maybe that's part of how these differences develop. So I think some interesting ideas. Don't have any data on it yet, except from very initial data that the abstraction learners really show more recruitment of those anterior frontal areas. But so those are some ideas about where these things may develop and what their etiology is, origins, what their origins are.
Hey, thank you. I think this also tapped a little bit into another question, which was whether you can instruct or intervene and help the exemplar learners. So we also discussed that they may have advantages in other tasks that we're not seeing here. So
yeah, I think isn't that one of the questions that a lot of us struggle with, interested in education and learning, is that how do you get some learners who don't seem to fairly straightforwardly pick up these abstractions? How do you get them to move toward that? I think it's just such a critical, important question. And as I said during the talk, I don't have any ready answers at this point. There's this idea that we do it through active learning. I mean, this has been a real movement over the past decade. And we were interested to see that in our biology situation, instructors very committed to active learning, very, very committed to trying to get students to get the underlying concept. We still seem to find a segment of learners who weren't acquiring that well enough to do well on transfer items. They just kind of dramatically got worse on the transfer items. So I mean, who knows? We don't know. Maybe it moved some of the learners toward a more abstraction representation. It could have, we don't know that, but it didn't move all the learners that way, it looks like. And so what can we do? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, this productive failure kind of idea seems like it could be something, it could be, I mean, at Washington, the peer-led team learning, that is really good for students. We're finding that's really good for students. But they have to sign on, they have to commit. It's outside of class. They go and meet in these small groups every week. They have assignments, and it seems to be that kind of deep discussion of what are the concepts and principles that are embedded in this problem could help. There's one more thing, and we've never been able to do the study, but there's an orientation, an instructional movement called process-oriented guided inquiry learning, POGL for short. Rick Boog at Franklin and Marshall, along with some colleagues, started this a while ago, and now it's a big collection of instructors in different courses where materials are developed, and these materials take a long time to develop, in which students look at data, they kind of discover their own ideas about the relationships, and then at the end you introduce the terminology and the lesson you're trying to convey. So it follows the learning cycle: discovery, learning, and then generalization. I'm not sure those exactly the terms that have been used, but and I sat in on one of Rick Boog's classes, and it's fascinating. He does very little instruction. He just says, okay, now let's get to this problem. And I sat in a group of 3 students. And so, for example, in math, one of the things that can be done is to step a student through to a realization of a concept of what a function is. Well, this was some chemistry concept, I don't know. And the students in the group said, well, I think you've got to try this approach. I mean, remember it worked here. And somebody said, I disagree with that. I think that's not the right approach here. This is the better approach. And they're working through these problems, every student, every classroom, very little lecture. And the idea is to the students to achieve deeper understanding. Does it? Well, in some studies, I don't know the studies like well claims that it does. But what I'd really like to, so that's great. What I'd like to know is, would learners that we identify as exemplar learners, how would they fare in that situation? And would they show at the end of the class some facility with these underlying concepts that they wouldn't show if they went through a standard chemistry class? Rick and I talked about doing some work on this, but his class sizes are so small that we really wouldn't have been able to get the power that we needed to examine this fruitfully. But sometimes I've gone to POGL meetings and I've expressed an interest in this. No one's taken me up on the offer to maybe try to do something. But so for me, theoretically, all the theory in POGL suggests that this is an approach that if people can get the underlying understanding, it ought to help. It ought to help a wide segment of students, including exemplar learners. I don't know, but it's possible.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Mark. Your talk certainly has generated a lot of interest. I've been noting down all the questions. I think we touched on most things. Some things, there's more details in there, or some ideas on children's learning errors in speaking that might hint to where they are at in terms of abstract or exemplar learners. But so we'll make sure that you see all those interesting comments.
Oh, good. Are you going to email them to me? Beatrice,
Yeah.
you'll email them? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I really enjoyed your talk, and then think the interest that it generated shows that so many here enjoyed your talk. So thank you so much, Mark, for taking the time and speaking to us today. And with that, we'll conclude our seminar for today. And we'll be back on May 17th, so roughly a month. We'll have Claudia van Bastiaan, who will talk about the mechanisms of cognitive training and transfer effects, capacity and efficiency. So we look forward to seeing you then. And thanks again so much, Mark.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for all the comments and all the attention that you gave. Thank you.